So you may have heard me mention something already in class called callbacks. And I've thrown this word around a few times, but we haven't actually stopped and spoke about what a callback is or what it means. But that's the whole focus of this video. So before we get too into depth into what a callback is, I think it's very important we spend some time making sure we completely understand what a function is and what all of the different parts of a function represent. So we've got a nice graphic here, and I highly encourage you to pause the video, take a look at it, make sure you read it in full, but we'll go through and explain it together here. So we're all familiar with what it looks like to actually define a function. So I can define a function here. Function add, let's say we get number, first number, second number, and then we return first number plus second number. So we all know how to write a function. However, I know when I was learning JavaScript, I never spent the time to learn what all the actual parts of the function were called and what they represent. But it's important because once we start getting to more advanced JavaScript, we need to refer to certain parts of the function by their name because it implies a certain type of functionality. So we'll take some time to understand that now. The first thing is the keyword. So last class we learned about the difference between a function declaration, which is what we see here using the function keyword, and then an arrow function. Arrow functions don't use that function keyword. Next to that, we've got the function name, making it a named function. If we omit that name, it becomes an anonymous function. So there is no name to that, and we're going to get back to that in just a minute. The arguments that we pass to a function, those are called parameters, and you can think of those as like placeholder variables for whatever values we ultimately pass to the function when we invoke it. We haven't spoken about this too much, but you can also set a default value of a parameter. If there's a case where you don't always expect a function to have a unique value, then you can set up a default value for that. And then we've got the scope. So everything within the curly brackets, which you can see here, scope start and scope end, that's considered the function scope. So that when we define variables within that scope, they're only accessible in there. And then we've got the body of the function, the return statement. Now, when we invoke a function, if we were to assign that to a variable, we can just use a const, give that variable name, and to invoke that function, we use the name of that function or a reference to that function, and then we use the curly brackets passing the arguments. Oftentimes you hear people throwing around the words parameters or arguments. Parameters are when you're defining the functions, those are the placeholders. Arguments are the actual values that you pass to it. Now, keep this word reference in the back of your mind because we're going to come back to that shortly. So what is a callback function? A callback function is a fancy way of saying a function that is an argument, that is a parameter to a function. So if I were to create a new function here, we could do something like, let's call function completed homework, and then we'll give it a subject, and then the second argument, we're going to give it a callback. We'll do something like this. So we're going to use alert. And we're going to use template strings, and let's just say it's a function to let us know when our homework is done. You have finished your homework. Your subject homework. And what we can do with the callback is, because we're passing a function as an argument, in this function here, we can invoke this callback. So a callback isn't a function itself, it's a reference to a function. And a reference to a function would just be passing the function name. So let's go ahead and give this a shot here. I've got an index page set up. We've got our index.js file linked to that. I'm going to call this function. I'm going to invoke this function down here. So we should see it happen straight away. So let's close this up. Let's open up the browser alongside this so we can see it right when we save. I think it's here. So we can see this is a file. I'm going to call completed homework here. We're going to pass it the first subject. So let's say we did our math homework. And then we'll pass a reference to a function here. And a reference to a function can just be something like this. So let's modify our add function so it just console.log something instead. Log. Actually, no, let's not use this because it's a bit more complicated because now we've got function parameters in there. Let's function success log message. So let's say we have another function that console.logs. Console.log successfully completed homework. Oop. We can already see it's going there. Callback is not a function yet because we haven't passed it in yet. There we go. So we've got this success message function. All it does is console.log the homework. We've got our completed homework function, which takes a subject, which will just alert, and then it takes a callback. And that callback is a reference to a function. And by reference, I just mean the name of that function. So we pass the success message in here. And if I save it, we can go ahead and see you have finished your math homework. And when I click OK, it calls the second function, the callback, saying we have successfully completed our homework. Now, why do we need callbacks? The example I've just put here kind of illustrates one of the reasons we need it. Callbacks give us a way of executing code after an event, after something's happened. And we kind of already know about callbacks because we've used event listeners. So the functions that we pass to our event listeners are callback functions. And you know they're callback functions, one, because they're a parameter to a function. It's a function that's a parameter to a function, but also because we get an event. And after that event occurs, we call a function. And let's take a look at that for a second. So let's get rid of this and this here. And we're gonna, so we've got, let's throw a button in our DOM here. Button, click me. Call my ID clicker. Oh, I didn't save a JavaScript file. So we'll do document.getElementById, clicker, it's a button, it's a clicker. And now let's do button.add event listener. We're gonna listen for the click event, of course. And then this is where we can pass in our callback function. So we can use the same function we did up here. Do success message. Let's pass that in. Now if I click, I'm gonna get rid of this console.log here. We don't need this anymore. So now if I click, successfully completed homework. Now, you may have also remembered when we spoke about the difference between a named function and an anonymous function. So you can think of a named function as a function that's got a name. So basically all the normal function you're used to here. So see how we've got the function keyword and there's a name to that function, function keyword, there's a name to that function. That's all a named function is. Now, when we learned about arrow functions, we don't have that function keyword. So if we change this success message const success message equals an arrow function, So we're still passing that as a callback. Now this is an anonymous function. This is an anonymous function because it has no name. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, Braden, it has a name. The name is the name of the variable. But that's the name of the variable. That's not the name of the function. And if I can prove this simply by copying this whole thing, pasting this in there, and now we're still passing a callback to the function. We're just defining it directly in line. There is no function name. In terms of the technical rationale behind this, honestly, at the top of my head, I can't think of any examples of where it's super important to make sure you're using a named function versus an anonymous function. But this vocabulary exists, and you'll probably read it a lot in articles and documentation, that sort of thing. So it's just important to be familiar to understand with what an anonymous function represents. Now, in some of the examples from class, specifically last week when we were dealing with forms, you may have seen me access an argument in the callback here. So we've got the event. And many moons ago, when we were learning just about the method addEventListener, I did a console.log on the event. And the event is created from clicking on it, clicking on whatever element you've added the event listener to, and we can take a look at it here. So it's just a big, in this case, it's a mouse event, and it's an event, aka it's just a big object that represents many properties that collectively create the event that we're listening for. And I remember when I first saw this, I thought it was a bit magic because suddenly we get this, we pass a function and we get this variable that we didn't declare, just kind of comes out of nowhere. But this is part of the magic of callbacks, and I'm going to try to illustrate where this variable comes from in the example above. So if I, in this function, create something, so in this, it's quite a contrived function. We've got a completed homework function. All it does is alert. But maybe we do something where we have some sort of calculation. So maybe we've got another function in here called add, and remember we can define functions in functions. So I'm going to create a callback called const add equals an arrow function. We get, actually let's call it a square number. This is easy because then I can just pass one number in. We do number times number, and so that's a function, and then we do const squared number equals squared, and let's call that with maybe 54. This is a poor example because it's not really real world. I'm just kind of doing a bunch of random stuff in here. But what I do want to illustrate is that I can suddenly pass this variable to the callback. And that means any function that I pass here could, in theory, have access to that squared number. So let's go back to our original example here, and let's go call this completed homework. So we're calling completed homework again, we're passing the math subject, and we're passing the success message, but we're doing nothing different. So when I save the file here, it alerts for us on the left side, I click OK, it calls the successfully completed homework. Now, since I'm passing our success message function as a reference here, I could actually access the squared number. So we can go squared number, and then suddenly, if I go like this, we console.log the squared number, we save again, click OK, successfully completed homework, and then we get our squared number. And it definitely kind of feels magic the first time you see this. And it's hard to reason about, what are the real world examples for this sort of thing. And I'll be honest and say that it'll probably be a while before you're in a situation where you need to write code that's this, of this level. I think what you'll more often be doing right now is consuming code like this. So it's often you'll be working with functions provided by a third party or from an API or something like that, that accept a callback and give you access to a variable from inside the scope of the function that you're invoking. The most obvious example of that we've dealt with so far is this example with the add event listener. So this add event listener function, there's a lot of magic going on here because it comes straight from straight from the browser. But it's the browser's implementation of how they've written this add event listener method that gives us access to the event. And the same is true for any callback that gives us access to some sort of function parameter to use inside the callback function itself. So it's quite a bit to wrap your head around, but definitely take some time to play around with these sort of examples and get familiar with the concept of using functions inside functions, functions as arguments, as callbacks, and understanding where these variables come from. Now, again, I definitely want to touch on the difference between a function reference and invoking a function, because I still see this quite often as a mistake that a lot of people are doing in class. Now, a function reference is simply passing the name of the function. So see how in this completed homework, when we pass our success message function as the callback argument, we're not invoking it. And remember, invoking it, and we can go back to our, let me click OK here. Invoking it is to, it's another way of saying call a function, run a function, invoke a function. When we invoke it, it's when we're passing those curly brackets right beside the name of the function. So if I were to do something like this, let's see what happens differently. So if I just call this function here, let's go back to our document. What do we think is going to happen? So let's save it. First of all, we can see something happen straight away. We got undefined straight away. And we click OK, and then we get an error. So a couple different things happen there. So by invoking the function straight away, we've already called it. It's already been executed. So we're not actually passing anything now as this argument. What we're passing is undefined because this function doesn't return anything. By invoking the function, you're passing in as the argument to that function whatever the return value of success message would be in this case. So ultimately what happens is success message gets run right away. It returns undefined because it no longer gets access to that squared number. Completed homework throws an error because it can't, in our case, nothing is being returned from success message, so it's not actually a function, so it can't be invoked. You could, in theory, protect yourself from this sort of thing if you wanted to do something like this. If type of callback equals, actually, let's start by logging out type of callback. Let's get rid of our function invocation here. Make sure things are working smoothly. Let's just console.log type of So we can see here, type of callback is a function. So if we wanted to, we do something like this. So if type of callback equals function, then we invoke our callback. So here it works, of course, because this is a function reference. However, if we suddenly invoke this function, we're not returning a function from this first function here. If we go ahead and click save, we still get undefined because we're not getting access to the function argument up here, but we don't get an error this time. So there's certainly some complexity involved when dealing with these higher order functions, but it's important to remember that when a function is used as an argument to another function, it's considered a callback. You can give yourself access to arguments by passing them directly to the callback function. Add event listener actually takes a callback function, and you've got access to the event here. And finally, an anonymous function is a function that doesn't have a name. So all arrow functions are anonymous functions. However, functions defined using the function keyword can also be anonymous functions if you delete the name and make sure to save them in a variable. So we can do something like this. This is now an anonymous function. That works the same. At the end of the day, all functions are mainly just you can almost treat them as variables. So you should think of a function just the same as a variable, except it's a bit special in the fact that you can call it and return some sort of other information. It's a way of sharing logic across your app. It's a way of reusing logic, but just as you can pass a variable as an argument to a function, you can pass a function as an argument to a function.